Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, the U.S. media celebrate the release of journalist Roxana Saberi from an Iranian prison.
Today, Roxana is a free woman.
But they're strangely silent about foreign journalists held by the U.S. Another war with a shortage of witnesses. Who's counting the casualties in Sri Lanka?
There are still thousands of civilians. The army don't know exactly how many.
The oil company that took on the mainstream media at their own game and lost. And the Israeli-produced animation that's making the case for freedom in Gaza. The release of the jailed American journalist Roxana Saberi by an Iranian court this past week led to a torrent of celebratory news stories across the U.S. news media. After Saberi's arrest in January, her case became a cause célèbre, a potentially dicey issue in the diplomatic rapprochement that could be occurring between Iran and the American government under Barack Obama. The Saberi case and the coverage of it raises questions about the disparity between the American media's coverage of her story and that of journalists detained without trial by the U.S. in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo Bay. Reuters, the Associated Press, and Al Jazeera have all had journalists arrested and held for prolonged periods by America without trial. So where's the coverage of their stories? That's our starting point this week, the media and the double standard that's in play when the U.S. puts journalists behind bars and keeps them there.
We've been following closely the news from Iran on Roxana Saberi.
Big news about our jailed U.S. journalist Roxana Saberi.
American journalist Roxana Saberi was released from prison in Iran today.
An appeals court suspended Roxana Saberi's sentence and said she can leave Iran immediately.
She is currently with her family and will be leaving Tehran to return to the United States in the coming days.
I think the media campaign for Roxana Saberi had a tremendous impact.
It was used to show that the Iranian government is this oppressive and tyrannical government that disregards press freedom.
So it captured international attention. But what about the others?
The media love these kinds of stories. Intrepid, not to mention attractive, American reporter released on appeal from an Iranian prison.
Her release may have come as a welcome surprise, but according to her father, Roxana never gave up hope.
Freedom for the reporter, chalk one up for freedom of the press, and cue the American media's in-house celebration.
Well, we've got some good news for you out of Iran for a change. Journalist Roxana Saberi is now free.
Media watchdogs, though, like Glenn Greenwald at Salon.com, see the story another way.
It's really the American media that's intended to be the principal safeguard against abuses of power by the American government. And when the American media ignores the American government's oppressive actions, that not only is a profound failure of duty on the part of the American media, it is that, but I think even worse is it's deceitful and misleading.
Greenwald's talking about 3 cases where the U.S. jailed foreign journalists, held them for much longer than the Iranians held Saberi, and never gave them a chance to defend themselves in court. Al Jazeera cameraman Sami Al-Haj was arrested in Pakistan. He spent 6.5 years in U.S. custody, most of it at Guantanamo Bay, and was never charged.
So why wasn't Sami Al-Haj given the attention of Roxana Saberi? Well, he just didn't fit the media narrative of the time, the war on terror.
Bilal Hussein is an Iraqi, an award-winning Associated Press photographer jailed by the Americans for 2 years in Iraq. He was never charged.
Don't forget, imprisoning journalists without trial is an American policy. It was an American policy justified by the war on terrorism.
Ibrahim Jassam is still behind bars. He's a freelance Iraqi photographer who was working for Reuters when he was arrested 8 months ago. The U.S. military has ignored an Iraqi court that ordered Jassam be released because of a lack of evidence. He hasn't been charged either. Al-Haj, Hussein, and Jassam, all journalists jailed by the U.S., but for some reason, their stories have gone relatively untold in the American media.
It's the story of a journalist who is accused of espionage.
I looked at how many mentions, media mentions, of Roxana Saberi there have been in the last 2 months since she was detained in Iran. And it exceeds the number of mentions in the American media of her name exceed 2,000. It's an extraordinary amount. And yet, for the first 6 years of Sami Al-Haj's detention, there were 101 references The imprisonment of Bilal Hussein in Iraq had several hundred, and the current imprisonment of Ibrahim Qasim has a grand total of 71 mentions. And so what you see is a massive disparity.
Today, Roxana is a free woman.
In America, of course, they love their own. But for God's sake, don't imprison other people's, other journalists for long periods without trial, without any charges, and then ignore them altogether. And the media here is to blame.
Those who blame the media do so because they understand the power of the media.
The pressure grew too much for the Iranians.
Absolutely. I think the fact that you had groups coming together to call for her release played a major impact. And I think it raised the profile of the case. And I would take issue with the notion that American journalists have not and did not and continue to protest the cases of journalists imprisoned by the United States. The Committee to Protect Journalists has very vehemently argued that the United States should release those journalists that have been detained without charges, whether in Guantanamo Bay, Iraq, or Afghanistan.
However, journalists joining a lobby group and contributing articles to a website does not have nearly the same impact as putting a story on the air or getting it in print. Here's another example of what looks like a double standard. The New Republic is an influential American magazine considered to be liberal. It posted a slideshow of journalists imprisoned around the world. It mentioned Roxana Saberi and cases in Russia, China, Cuba, Sri Lanka, but nothing on who the U.S. government is holding.
She is an American citizen, and I have complete confidence that she was not engaging in any sort of espionage.
It's absolutely hypocritical. Why not highlight the case of the Reuters freelancer who's been held without charge and has actually been freed by, or has been told there's no evidence against him by an Iraqi court, but still the Americans hold him.
When you keep silent about the arrest of somebody because he's a Muslim, and then you create hell because he's American, the world is not blind to this. People can see it.
In the mind of the American public, and it's not really their fault, it's clearly the fault of the American media. Imprisoning journalists is something that Muslim countries do, or that Iran does. And the reason why Americans have such a distorted and warped sense of reality, of what our government actually does, is because that's the perception of the American media creates for them.
And that, in a nutshell, is the problem. Different media narratives and people seeing the world differently, depending on who's doing the reporting and from where. Here's how our Global Village voices see the media coverage of the Roxana Saberi case.
Given that she's an American citizen, it's not really surprising that Roxana Saberi was released so soon. On the other hand, there are still a number of journalists and bloggers imprisoned in Iran, including Canadian Iranian Hossein Darakhshan. And I think that we should be lobbying on their behalf rather than just applauding the release of Roxana Saberi and forgetting about it.
Roxana Saberi definitely did get a lot more coverage than many imprisoned or otherwise harmed journalists around the world. It has to do with her appearance. We all know that people who appear Western get more media coverage. It's a sad and unpleasant fact of the trade.
There are now a number of ways for you to get in touch with us in order to become one of our Global Village voices. You can email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net, or just go on Facebook and look for the Listening Post page. Or you can follow us on Twitter. We can let you know via Facebook or Twitter what stories we're working on and how you can get with the program and contribute to the broadcast. Time now for Listening Post News Bites. Israel has taken a critical pounding over its restrictions on the media covering the Palestinian territories. Now, a new report written by Palestinians indicates the authorities in Palestine have their own issues when it comes to freedom of the press. The report was written by the Palestine Center for Development and Media Studies and looked at restrictions on coverage in 2008. It accused the Israelis of 147 violations and Palestinian security services of 110.
Won't be getting into the Gaza Strip again today.
The report listed 51 Israeli arrests and detentions of reporters and the closure of 4 broadcast stations. On the Palestinian side, the Hamas-Fatah rivalry led to 60 journalists being arrested, some reportedly tortured by security forces on the West Bank or in Gaza, and there were 5 newspapers closed. Radio France International has been shut down in northeastern Congo, accused of inciting unrest in a war zone. RFI used a local radio station called Canal Révélation to air its broadcasts, but the Congolese authorities put an end to that and confiscated broadcast equipment. Congo's information minister Lambert Mende said the station was, quote, throwing oil on the fire of all the armed conflicts in the country's east, unquote. The media freedom group Reporters Without Borders wrote to the minister condemning the shutdown and urging him to restore the broadcasts. It looks like a news report, sounds like a news report,
A bitter environmental
but this is no news report. It's just a little something the U.S. energy giant Chevron put together and posted on YouTube to counter a real news report by the CBS News magazine show 60 Minutes in the U.S. Chevron posted the piece 2 weeks before the CBS story went to air. The 60 Minutes broadcast eventually attracted 12 million viewers. Chevron's YouTube effort got just a few thousand hits, and some of those might have been their own executives.
General Wayne Downing, General Montgomery Meigs, and Colonel Ken Howard.
Last year, we reported on the New York Times' expose of the Pentagon Pundits program. The Times revealed how, in the run-up to the Iraq War, the Pentagon briefed retired military men and then sent them onto U.S. news channels to make the case for war. Recently, the reporter who broke that story, David Barstow, won the Pulitzer Prize for journalistic excellence. This is a rare image. Barstow on camera. He told democracynow.org that the news networks implicated in his story have ignored it.
I haven't received many invitations. In fact, any invitations.
At least the Pentagon acted after Barstow broke the news. It killed the Pundits program. But the Pentagon's enablers, the news networks, continue to treat the story like it never happened. When the late music composer Maurice Jarre died in March, media outlets around the world quoted him, saying, "One could say my life itself has been one long soundtrack. When I die, there will be a final waltz playing in my head that only I can hear." It was a lovely quote, only he never said it. It was actually written by an Irish student named Shane Fitzgerald, who posted it on Wikipedia. It was a social experiment, he said, to highlight how journalists use the internet as a primary source of information without ever confirming that information. Among the publications that fell for the quote, the UK's Guardian and independent newspapers, the BBC Music magazine, as well as newspapers in India and Australia. Now, there's a term for when reporters get something wrong and others follow suit. It's not journalism, it's churnalism. We're back after the break with a report on the Sri Lankan government and the media blackout in the war zone.